All right,
Welcome to
we're going to get
Stories of
going.
Brisco and Bradshaw.
We
Be
we
quiet, Mr.
rolling.
Brisco. He started the show. Bradshaw, the loudmouth right there is Mr. Brisco from Oklahoma, Oklahoma's greatest son, Chickasaw native, Chickasaw Hall of Famer. And we got wrestling's greatest historian, our favorite historian, Hall of Fame historian, Mr. Tony Richards. And we are on God Bless Texas, episode 11. Tony, let's get started
Boy,
with God Bless.
I can tell you're back home from Texas. You're back in that Maryland where you call home now, where you
I
hang
don't
your hat.
call this place home. I call
Hey,
this place.
Tony, you're a country boy. Where you
Yep,
hang your hat, you're home, right?
that's it. That's it.
Well, look
Nope.
behind him. His hat's hanging on the damn sword behind him.
Yeah,
So
he's
that's
Nope.
got
home.
lots of hats hanging.
I call
Yeah.
Maryland a lot of things. I don't call it home. They can have this
you
place.
you used to date a young Maryland too, I understand.
Well, I married one. That's why I'm here.
Okay. No, name Marilyn. I know Marilyn's a good nice lady. I'm not gonna get you in trouble with her. She's too
You better
nice.
not. She'll call
Yeah.
you.
I know she will. I'm scared of her.
We better move on to Texas wrestling.
God bless Texas.
Texas wrestling, that keeps us out of trouble here. Yeah, a
Yeah.
lot going on in Texas wrestling. Tony, just bring us up and kind of catch us up from last week. What we covered there,
Yeah.
real briefly, so because we got so much to cover today, man.
Yeah. So the last two episodes, episode 9 and episode 10, we covered some of the wars in Texas wrestling in the 1950s. Greg Klein was here for episode 9, and we talked about the war between Dallas and Houston. And then in our last episode, episode 10, we talked about Albuquerque, New Mexico, and El Paso, Texas. And Amarillo eventually winning that war and pulling El Paso and Albuquerque into the Amarillo office. So we're in the mid 50s, and we'll finish up the 50s today over on the east side of the state, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and wrap up the wrestling wars. But you never really actually wrap up a wrestling war. It just seemed like in the whole history of wrestling, there's always this dispute over who owns a town, who controls a building, who has the right to book talent, who can use whose world champion is the world champion, and all of that. So how much money can one promoter lose trying to beat the other promoter? It just seems like it's gone on throughout the entire history of wrestling. But it did come to a close in Texas. And
Tony, it seems to me like there's two things that determine a war. Number one, who gets to use the champion.
Mm-hmm.
The big champion, the NWA that we're talking about in this case here. And number two, who gets the best TV?
Yes, television changed everything.
Yeah.
That's probably the single greatest technology development affecting wrestling during the 1950s was television. And in the mid 1950s, the national network burnout was really, really heavy. And
you know what caused that national burnout was just too much of the national burnout?
18 different wrestling shows on
holy cow
on at the same time nationally. And the Dumont Network even eventually went out of business in 1956. So it was
they didn't morph into another network. They just went out of business, right?
No, they just went out of business, leaving the big three then, NBC, CBS, and ABC for years, well, until the 1980s when Fox came along. There were just three major national networks for 30 years from the 1950s to the 1980s. But, when promoters began to control their own local television, that just changed the entire game because a promoter, before television, a promoter had to advertise a wrestler's arrival through newspaper or radio or the old-fashioned way of beating the streets and hanging posters, handing out handbills, or just word of mouth like the Whisker Savage and people of that decade where people would just get buzzed about a certain fella and tell their neighbors, we got to go see this guy at the wrestling matches. Well, television changed all that. Now wrestlers could come into people's houses through the television into their own living room, and a fan could see the wrestler's face, they could hear his voice, they could watch his mannerisms, they could see the finishing moves that they had, and they could develop an opinion about him before they ever bought a ticket. And so television didn't really change the live gate receipts, but it did change the economics of how those gate receipts were achieved. And a lot
Now,
of
wait a minute. In the beginning, it changed the gate receipts tremendously, right? In the beginning, because
well, in
people
the
were
beginning, yeah, it
staying
did
home and then
drop them.
watching everything on TV
Yeah, it did.
until the promoters learned how to program their wrestlers.
Yeah, when they were just doing main event after main event after main event, fans didn't really see any need to go to the arena. But when they learned how to use television more like a commercial, that was when it began to change and drive gates up in the other direction. And, you know, it just became one big, gigantic commercial for the arena then at that point. And the local wrestling program would establish the characters and the rivalries, and the television announcer could tell viewers what happened and what wrestler appeared on camera. And then wrestlers could be on camera and challenge each other. And television audiences were then encouraged to come out to the arena on the night that they had regular wrestling and see what the payoff to everything was that they had seen on TV. And this became really important in Texas because by the middle 50s, you know, Texas wrestling promoters were starting to learn that the most valuable television program was not necessarily the one that showed the biggest matches. It was the one that made the audience want to see the big matches in person. And that distinction became the foundation of the Texas wrestling model. Now, another thing that I think kind of started to happen in the 1950s is what made Texas wrestling Texas wrestling? Well, in the 1950s, that became to be very, very clear. It was a strong local hero. It was a hard-working heel, a loudmouth heel. It was blood. It was long-running personal feuds. It was different ethnic and racial identities that appealed to some markets more than others. It was championship titles and belts, and it was television personalities, and it was frequent town-to-town movement. Texas was such a huge geographic territory. I mean, it's like we're talking about the Tennessee territory all over again as far as large geography, except Texas was pretty much in halves. You had the Dallas, Houston, San Antonio end, and then you had the Amarillo, El Paso, Lubbock end of the state. And a wrestler could work all of those and dozens of other small cities without necessarily being in the same promotion or working for the same promoter. So there was a distinctive interconnected wrestling culture that began to develop in Texas. And in the 1950s, it was the decade where we sort of saw the Texas style of professional wrestling begin to take a recognizable form. It didn't happen because somebody sat down and deliberately created a Texas formula. It just happened organically from the enormous geography of the state and the different ethnic and cultural communities that made up the wrestling audience, the influence of Mexico, the influence of lucha libre, the influence of the competitive nature of Texas promoters, and the growing proliferation of television. Texas wrestling had always been physical, but during the 1950s, the physicality became part of the identity of the product. The audience expected wrestling to look and feel tougher than the more polished presentation that they might find in other parts of the country. One of the defining characteristics was, like I said, the local hero. Texas fans wanted wrestlers they could identify with. Fritz von Erich is probably the greatest, clearest example, and we're going to talk about him today. But that was part of a larger tradition that had Pepper Gomez and Ray Gunkel and Dory Funk Sr. and Gory Guerrero and other wrestlers that weren't just interchangeable traveling stars. They became representatives of particular towns and cities and regions and communities. Wrestlers could become much more valuable to a Texas promoter by establishing a personal relationship with the local fans than just by holding a title belt. Texas style also put a lot of emphasis on personal feuds. You know, championships were important. That's why the Texas title was created. And we're going to have another title that's created today on our show. But often the championship was secondary to between the hatred between the two wrestlers. The audience wanted to see the hero get revenge against the villain who had humiliated him or who had injured him or who had cheated him or who had attacked him. And that created a wrestling style built around escalation. A feud might begin with a controversial decision or maybe an argument, and then develop into cheating and interference, and then progress into violent matches, and then culminate in a major grudge match or what we call a blow-off. The emotional payoff was more important than the technical result of the championship match itself. And then there was the physical credibility. Texas audiences tended to respond strongly to wrestlers who looked like legitimate fighters, whose matches conveyed the impression that something genuinely unpleasant could happen here. Blood, brawling outside the ring, hard punches, roughhouse tactics, and dramatic beatdowns became part of the whole tools of promoting wrestling matches. That means every Texas match, it wasn't necessarily a wild brawl. Technical wrestling remained an important part of the product, but Texas promoters understood that a violent confrontation could create a tremendous emotional response and sell the rematch. I remember seeing Gary Hart do an interview one time, a shoot interview, where if a guy that he booked in Dallas, for example, would come to him and say, hey, we can you ask the other guy to tone it down a little bit? And Gary's response was always, hey, man, this is Texas. This is how we do it here. This is Texas-style wrestling. If you can't...
That's the guy you go to that has to tone it down.
Yeah, exactly right.
But he would just tell him, like, dude, if you're already complaining, you probably ought to just go somewhere else, because we're actually going to ratchet it up. We're not going to tone it down. And the whole geography of Texas added to the Texas style of wrestling too. The network of wrestling communities with its own stars and own preferences. Major cities supplied the publicity and the television exposure, and the smaller towns provided important weekly revenue and helped build wrestlers through repeated appearances. Yeah, you could get a big payoff in Houston, and you might get a pretty good payoff in San Antonio, but working the Galvestons and the Beaumonts and the Killeens and the towns like that helped pay a wrestler's salary for the week. And while it didn't draw like as big a crowds as the major cities, putting a whole string of smaller towns together helped keep wrestlers employed, where for maybe the first time in history, wrestlers didn't have to have a secondary job or work in another thing besides they could be full-time professional wrestlers. And television accelerated all of it. Fans could see wrestlers every single week. Promoters never had to explain who the good guys and the bad guys were. They could tell from the television. The audience could watch the villain cheat, see the hero suffer the consequences, and then be told to come to the arena to see the next chapter. So television became like the serial storytelling mechanism for Texas wrestling, the arena where the story was resolved. This made the relationship between television and the live event really important, and it helped Texas promoters develop stars who were recognizable beyond the people who actually went to the matches.
Tony, let me jump in.
Go ahead.
We know Jim Barnett through equipment breakdown started studio wrestling. Wrestling on television in Texas was not done at this time in studios. It was done in the major arenas
it sort of followed the pattern that the syndicated Best of Texas Wrestling show, which was done at the Sportatorium. So the Sportatorium was an arena and a television studio. It was a little bit like Florida, except the Florida matches took place at the Fort Homer Hesterly or across the bay in St. Petersburg, and the television taping took place at the Sportatorium. Well, in Texas and Dallas, it was both. It was where they did the television and where they drew the crowds every Tuesday night. So people were used to seeing big arena-style matches on television in Texas rather than the studio. And Dallas did go to studio wrestling here in the late 1950s, but eventually it would go back to doing them in the Sportatorium. So when we talk about the Texas style, we're talking about physical credibility, strong heroes, intense rivalries, larger-than-life villains, blood and violence, ethnic and regional identity, television storytelling, and a deep connection between the wrestler and the local audience. So during the 1950s, it clearly became developed in people like Fritz von Erich, Johnny Valentine, Dory Funk Sr., Joe Blanchard, Gory Guerrero, and the next generation of Texas stars. So by the 1950s, It wasn't just a period of when Texas had wrestling wars. It was the decade when Texas developed its own wrestling identity. The end of the 1950s also saw the rebuilding of the Texas Wrestling Agency. You know, we covered that in one of our previous episodes, where pretty much all the talent in Texas was controlled by one wrestling agency in Houston. And the Texas Wrestling Wars broke all that up. Well, they started rebuilding the Texas Wrestling Agency, and the only thing that was missing was one big important component, Doc Sarpolis. He didn't go back to his old position. Instead, he opened a furniture store, and then he went west and opened up and bought the Amarillo promotion. So he wasn't part of the rebuilding of the Texas Wrestling Agency with Frank Burke and Ronnie Burke, who replaced the old Siegel, Burke, Sarpolis structure. So Siegel had to reconstruct the machinery that made him the czar of Texas wrestling, and it had supplied wrestlers to the entire state. What happened when they reconstructed it was it had less power and authority. So what you had was, instead of a promoter who just promoted his town with talent that all came from Houston, you had some talent that came from Houston, but you also had promoters that were booking their own people in. And that's kind of what you ended up seeing with Paul Bosch in Houston in later years. He would use the booking office in Dallas to book most of the card, except maybe in the main event or the semi-main event, he'd book his own guys in, like Johnny Valentine or Wahoo McDaniel or the Funks or some of those kinds of people. So even though they reconstructed the Texas Wrestling Agency in the late 50s, it didn't have near the power and authority that it had before the Texas Wrestling War. So this kind of elevated a guy that we're very familiar with in Houston, Paul Bosch. So the wrestling war had demonstrated that Siegel needed trusted people who could manage his day-to-day operations, while he concerned mostly with the larger business. And Paul Bosch had already become increasingly influential in Houston, particularly through radio, television, and promotion. And so the rebuilding years after the Texas Wrestling War he became the apprentice to Morris Siegel. And the 1954 and 1959 years of the restoration of the Texas Territory machine was that, rather than a return to the old empire that Siegel had had before. And probably the most important decision that Morris Siegel ever made was to make Paul Bosch his right-hand man. Houston was the Texas city that most successfully embraced television during the first half of the 50s. The Houston Wrestling Show had already established a powerful weekly wrestling tradition before television ever arrived. The city auditorium was the center of their business, and Friday night wrestling had become a Houston tradition. Then came Paul Bosch. Bosch had been forced out of active wrestling after a serious automobile accident in 1947, and Siegel brought him into his organizations, initially using him as an advisor and a radio announcer. And then when television began developing in Houston around 1949, Bosch became the promotion's first television commentator. Houston wrestling moved among stations during its early television years before it finally found its long-term home on KHTV in Houston. And Bosch understood television was not just another place to show wrestling. It was a place to build a wrestling personality. And boy, did he ever. His announcing style became part of the Houston product. It's inseparable. I mean, when you think about Houston wrestling, you automatically hear Paul Bosch's voice.
Was he by himself on the commentary booth?
Yeah, he did the wrestling announcing by himself.
Is there anybody that you could compare his style to? I mean, any wrestling or even any other sport announcer? Was he just a legit guy? Or
now that you say any other sports announcer, he had a distinctive style. He's a lot like a Lance Russell in Memphis, or a outside the sport, a Jack Buck in St. Louis, or a Vin Scully in Los Angeles, where you hear his
legit type style.
You just hear his voice and you're like, oh, this is Dodgers baseball, or oh, this is Cardinal baseball, or this is Memphis wrestling. I hear Lance Russell. That was kind of the Paul Bosch style. And to be honest with you, before the 80s, I don't remember any wrestling product besides Lance Russell and Dave Brown ever having more than one commentator. I mean, most of the wrestling shows only had one announcer until the 80s, until Gordon Soley brought Piper in, Roddy Piper, in 1982. Besides Lance and Dave, I can't think of another wrestling show that had more than one. Then in Florida, you know, Jerry, you did the show with Gordon for a while, and he also had Barbara Clary, and he did after Buddy Colt came back. But for years, it was just Gordon on the broadcast, and it was just him in Georgia, and it was just Bill Mercer in Dallas. It was
and
just
Eddie credit back in those days. It was all meant to keep a talent on TV. I mean, you know, when I started doing, I had a leg injury, and I couldn't compete on TV. So he wanted me to still be on TV. So he made me a commentator with Gordon.
Yeah,
which was difficult trying to keep up with Gordon.
Yeah, but you did a good job. I mean, you look good in a suit on the set. Bosch was born in Brooklyn.
You're just a good-looking man, Mr. Brisco. That's all it is.
Man, back in those days, he was killer.
What do you mean back in those days? What about now?
Yeah, what about now? Like, yeah,
well, you're not.
You hear him, some boy. Back in those days, he was good looking.
Yeah. Well, he's not groomed to the hilt and wearing a suit like he did back on Florida television. That's all I'm saying.
And that was so miserable being in Florida, having to wear a coat and tie.
Oh my God, wearing a suit in the middle of the heat is just god awful.
You had
that auditorium was 115 degrees without.
And it was, and you know what I thought was cool about it though? It was like Wide World of Sports. Those guys all wore gold jackets with the ABC logo. You guys all had the same jackets with the CWF logo on them. I thought that was cool.
Yeah, I still got my patch. I don't have the jacket anymore, but I still got my patch.
That's cool. Bosch was a New Yorker. This is what's interesting too, is he was born in Brooklyn in 1912, grew up on Long Island, graduated from high school in 1929, developed as an exceptional athlete. Swimming was his most particular strength. He was a young lifeguard credited with saving more than 130 lives over his lifeguard career. 1932, he finished third in the North Atlantic Coast Lifeguard.
130 lives? Can nobody swim?
Not in New York, I guess.
What the hell? I mean, that's like an inordinate amount. I mean, that's like a people drowning all the time.
Right. And who counts the saves?
1930. There's a lot of people to save. I mean,
oh my God, they need a swim instructor up there.
I guess. 1932, he finished third in the North Atlantic Coast Lifeguard competition. So this combination of athletic ability, physical courage, and communication skills would become the characteristics of his entire life. He got in professional wrestling in the 1930s. His career as an active wrestler took him throughout North America. He developed toughness.
You want prompted that move into professional wrestling?
Mm-mm.
In his book, I mean, have you read his book?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. It's been a while since I read it.
Yeah. I just wonder if there's any references there. It didn't seem like he was a fan of professional wrestling.
No. A lot of guys, weren't. It just seemed like a career.
Well, Gordon was doing race cars.
Stock car races. Yeah, absolutely. So he got in the 30s. So he moved throughout the territories throughout North America. One of his best known early matches associated with his career was he went 90 minutes with Pat Meehan in Calgary in 1938. But that was only the first chapter in his life. Like a lot of guys who were in professional wrestling, World War II changed him. He entered the U.S. Army in 1942. He eventually received an officer's commission. He became an infantry officer with the 121st Infantry Regiment of the 8th Infantry Division and went to Europe after D-Day in 1944. His military career was extraordinary. He fought in one of the most difficult campaigns of the European War and eventually commanded Company G during the fighting in the Hurtgen Forest. This was one of the most brutal battles ever fought by American Army in Europe. The terrain was heavily wooded. The weather was miserable, the German artillery was intense, and the forest was filled with mines and defensive positions, and American units suffered enormous casualties while advancing only short distances. Bosch was wounded during the fighting and received an impressive collection of decorations. He got the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the Combat Infantryman Badge, and the French Croix de Grue. His regiment also received a Distinguished Unit citation for its action in the battle. His wartime experiences became the subject of his 1962 memoir, Road to Hirchen Forest in Hell. The book is important because it documents Bosch's military service, but it also reveals something about him, who would later become one of wrestling's most important and respected promoters. His writing demonstrated a profound appreciation for courage, discipline, leadership, and the ordinary soldier, and those qualities would remain evident during his wrestling career. After he survived the battle and got out of the war and came back home, he got back into wrestling in 1947. He had the automobile accident when he was traveling from San Antonio to Corpus Christi, and that effectively ended his wrestling career. He suffered a badly broken leg and could no longer continue wrestling at the level required of a pro. And for most wrestlers, that kind of injury would have meant the end of their involvement in the business. But for Paul Bosch, it was the beginning of an entirely different second career. Morris Siegel, by this point, controlled Houston wrestling and was one of the most important wrestling promoters in Texas, and recognized something in Bosch that went beyond his ability as a wrestler. So he brought him into his organization, and Bosch became an advisor, a backstage assistant, and a radio announcer. Most importantly, though, he began to learn how to promote. This is one of the most significant aspects of Paul Bosch's career. He didn't simply purchase a wrestling territory and learn how to run it after becoming the owner. He spent 20 years learning the business under Morris Siegel before eventually taking control in the mid-'60s. He was, in fact...
I didn't realize it was 20 years he studied under Morris.
Yeah, essentially from 1947 until 1966. I think Morris Siegel, which probably in our next episode we will talk more about this, but Morris Siegel died in December of 1966, and that's when Paul Bosch took over the reins of Houston. But television, again, changed everything. Houston wrestling was already an established institution when television became a part of American life after World War II. Bosch became the promoter's first television commentator when Houston wrestling moved on to local television in 1949. He understood television was not just a way to show wrestling, it was a way to sell live events, and his broadcasts made the wrestlers' personalities and gave fans a reason to leave their homes and go to the City Auditorium and later the Sam Houston Coliseum. His voice was inseparable from Houston wrestling. For decades, Houston fans could watch Bosch introduce the wrestlers, explain the rivalries, and sell the upcoming Friday night card. He developed the ability to make the live event feel like something that had to be experienced live and in person. He was one of the fundamental This was one of the fundamental skills of a successful territory promoter. Television was the advertisement, but the arena was the product, and Bosch mastered that formula. His longevity was remarkable. His television presence continued for more than 3 decades, eventually making him one of the most recognizable wrestling personalities in Texas. And he also eventually got back in the ring on occasion. He would always typically do the blow off in most of his confrontations. I know he did one with Dory Funk Sr. I know he did one with Professor Boris Malenko.
He had a lot with Gary Hart too.
He had a lot of feuds with those guys, and they always ended up with a bathtub match. Where the heel gets put in the bath. The bathtub's in the ring. And whoever got put in the bathtub, that was the end of the match.
Texas wrestling right there.
Which would
I've
eventually
never heard of a bathtub match.
It would eventually evolve into what we know in modern times as a casket match, right? The Undertaker's he used that for a blow off match.
The bathtub match, that sounds horrible.
Yeah. Bruce Pritchard had to invent the bathtub match.
That's right.
Got his fingerprints on it.
And I've got Bruce right here.
There you go.
Look at there, Bruce the Bear. So the Houston market.
Anybody else do bathtub matches?
No, not that I know of.
That was Paul Boss exclusive.
That sounds horrible.
That was a Paul Bosch deal. He did.
God, you know how many
And
times I ended up in a casket? They'd always pretend like they couldn't find the key, and I'm backstage stuck in this.
Yeah.
They went every single time. You know when you get in there, somebody's going to rib you. And you're going to be in there
You're
for a
going to get
while.
ripped. Yeah.
I think Dusty Rhodes and Ivan Koloff
Oh
were
yeah.
booked. I think Dusty and Ivan Koloff were booked to do a bathtub match, and they didn't want to do it, so they changed it to a coffin match, and they had a coffin match instead.
That in Houston?
Yeah, in Houston. Yeah, it's out there on YouTube. So stars in the late 50s in Houston would have been Lou Thez, Buddy Rogers, Black Guzman, Rito Romero, Gory Guerrero, Duke Kiamuka, Ray Gunkel, Vern Gagne, Killer Kowalski, Pepper Gomez, Danny McShane. Thez and Rogers were the national championship level stars. Guzman, Romero, Guerrero, and Kiamuka would have been the Texas Mexican wrestling connection. Gunkel and Gomez were particularly important because they could function as local or regional heroes. They eventually, with Gunkel, who did they put with him? Jack Dempsey, I think. They put Jack Dempsey with Ray Gunkel as his advisor and manager that helped really get him over. Killer Kowalski was another important attraction. He came into Texas in 1950, became a major championship level heel. He would beat Rogers for the Texas Championship in Dallas of August of 1950. Houston in the 60s, completely the next generation of stars launched Houston into the next stratosphere. Some of those people would be Danny McShane. So Danny McShane was born in 1912. He developed his wrestling career during the great expansion of wrestling in the 30s. It was an era when the business was still heavily dependent upon traveling wrestlers, regional promoters, and booking offices, rather than the more clearly defined territory system that would come after World War II. McShane was particularly identified with Texas and the Southwest, where his physical appearance and wrestling persona fit perfect with what the promoters were trying to sell to its audiences. McShane looked like a regular, legitimate fighter. He was compact, powerful, and carried himself with intensity, and it made it easy for promoters to present him as a dangerous man. His reputation was built around toughness rather than athletic grace. That distinction is important when examining the evolution of Texas wrestling because the Texas audience was becoming more conditioned to appreciate wrestlers who looked as though they could actually fight, and McShane fit that philosophy perfectly. His career also intersected with some of the most important figures in the development of wrestling in Texas. During the 30s and 40s, Texas was not yet a single unified wrestling territory. Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Fort Worth, El Paso, Amarillo, Corpus, and other cities had different promotional arrangements, different booking relationships, and different local stars. Wrestlers moved through the territories according to those relationships between promoters and offices. But McShane had value beyond any match. He was part of the network that connected Texas to the rest of the United States. McShane was regularly on Wrestling in Chicago or Wrestling in Los Angeles. And one of the most important aspects of McShane's career was his association with the rough and tumble style that would be Texas wrestling. Most times, if people wanted an example of what Texas wrestling was, they would point to Danny McShane, and especially toward Danny McShane's rivalry with a man named Bull Curry. That style emphasized hard punches, headlocks, choking, roughhouse tactics, and a clear distinction between a good guy and a bad guy. McShane could function particularly effectively in that environment because the audience could believe that the violence was real. The line between wrestling and fighting was deliberately blurred. The rivalry.
You got a picture of McShane there? Did you pull up the picture of
The rivalry between McShane and Bull Curry would become one of the most defining rivalries of Texas wrestling, particularly in Houston. But Danny McShane's ability to generate intense reactions was partly dependent on having opponents who could convincingly withstand his brutality. And Bull Curry could take a beating, and so could Danny McShane. In fact, in the late 40s and early 50s, Doc Sarpoulos came up with the idea of blading because these guys were not going to last. There's Danny McShane.
There's Danny.
With the pencil-thin mustache. Because these guys were not going to physically be able to last continually beating themselves bloody and battered. So Sarpolis came up with the idea of using a blade to generate the blood instead of continual hard ways every single night. So McShane was the ideal opponent for Bull Curry as well. Their encounters represented a version of Texas wrestling in which the feud itself was the attraction. The audience was not necessarily coming to see a technically perfect wrestling match. It was coming to see two men who appeared to genuinely hate each other, and they were going to settle the fight in the ring. McShane's significance can therefore be understood partly through the way he helped establish the prototype of the Texas babyface. He did not necessarily have to be polished or glamorous, but he was tough. The Texas hero could
McShane was considered a hell of a technician, too, during it.
It was very similar to the way the Welches got over in Tennessee. The Texas hero could absorb the punishment and the beating and then fight back and refuse to be intimidated. It was a formula that would remain enormously important in Texas for years and years. And again, it was very close to the same way that Tennessee wrestling worked.
Right. And fans out there that pull up Bull Curry, some of his matches, you'll see what we're talking about. That Bull Curry had no style. I mean, the guy that he reminded me of most, as I was reading through the notes today, was a Brute Bernard type character. For the more recent people that can remember back to Brute in the 60s and 70s. Where Brute was the same type of character, I think, character driven as Bull Curry. And Brute might have got his style from Bull Curry. I don't know.
The McShane rivalry is especially revealing because it demonstrates how Texas wrestling evolved toward a style where personal animosity became the central point. The feud did not have to have television production that was elaborate or complicated storylines. The wrestlers themselves were the story. If the promoter could convince the audience that McShane hated Curry and Curry hated McShane, the audience had a reason to pay to see that settled. And that was the basic same philosophy that would later make Texas for stars like Fritz von Erich. Fritz's Texas persona was built around toughness, patriotism, and physical credibility. Johnny Valentine became one of the great embodiments of hard, legitimate Texas wrestling. The Funk family carried that tradition forward another step. Although these later stars had their own personalities and innovation, the environment which they became successful had been shaped by McShane and Curry. McShane's career also illustrates why the history of Texas wrestling cannot be reduced to the most famous promoters or the champions. The territory was constructed by hundreds of performers who traveled through towns and established reputations and taught audiences what professional wrestling was supposed to look and feel like. Some became household names. Others became remembered primarily by historians and dedicated fans. But Danny McShane belongs in a different category because his contribution was substantial to what you know as Texas wrestling.
And I did not know Danny was one on the national networks either. I didn't.
Yeah, if you pull up the Chicago, any of those old Chicago shows, he's on there. And I think there's a 1969 or 1970 match between Bull Curry and Johnny Valentine that every wrestling fan should watch on YouTube. I mean, it is a tough, awesome. I mean, you just find yourself just engrossed in those two guys who are some of the best psychologies wrestlers ever.
Jerry, did you ever work with Johnny?
Johnny Valentine?
Yeah.
Oh, God, I probably did 100-hour Broadway with them.
Really?
It got to the point where I asked George Scott if I had heat with him.
George, are you mad?
Johnny was stiff, wasn't he?
Oh, God, I get beat up every damn night, John, and for an hour and 10 minutes sometimes. For an hour and 15 minutes sometimes. I want 10 more minutes. I said, George, I can't beat him in an hour. Why would a babyface ask for 10 more minutes? Well, you're the babyface. Yeah. I never could understand. I said, he beat the hell out of me for an hour. I'm not going to go back out there for 2 minutes.
Just the way he looked. at you.
And the way he smothered your ass too. I mean, even in the corner standing up, John, he was right on top of him. His lockups, he would lean up. He was big, tall, like you. He would grab a lock up and he would lean on you. So you're carrying that weight no matter where he's positioned in the ring. You're carrying JV's weight around for an hour.
And that was all to make you fight back, right, Jerry?
All to make you fight back, yeah. And if he didn't want you to fight back, man, he'd let you know right away. He'd put every bit of that weight on. Not yet, kid. Not yet, kid. Not yet, kid. And just wait till I tell you to.
I remember.
I got where I would not make a move, and they said, "All right, kid, go."
I remember Wahoo saying that their matches got a lot better when he decided to fight back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like he just decided to haul off and just slug the hell out of him.
And about 45 minutes in, if you still had any breath, you better start fighting back because you know you're not getting anything from that.
Wahoo said, I just decided to haul off and just slug the hell out of him. And once I did that, man, our matches got a lot better because that was what he wanted me to do the whole time.
Yeah.
He wanted me to hit him hard. He wanted the match to be like that.
And if you didn't hit him hard, he'd just brush it off like it was them fly buzzing around him. And you had to hit him to make him do register even, you know. And man, could he register. Once he started registering, after the way he beat you, he just beat you up. And then once you babyface started, then you had him, man. You had him in the palm of your hand. I told you, kid, just come on, keep going. He was fun to work with, even though it was brutal.
Akbar always told me, said, it took Johnny longer to get over than most people. When he got over, he was more over, though, and stayed over longer.
That's exact great assessment of him. It took him a lot longer to get over on the Carolinas, and they got him over with hour draws. That's how the old school got Johnny Valentine was our Broadway.
Wow.
Same thing with sport. I was alternating, John, between, now get this, I'm 5'11", 5'5", about 5'11", whatever, 225 pounds. I'm wrestling every night, alternate between Johnny Valentine and Don Jardine the Sporter. And I'm going an hour Broadway with them every damn night. You can look it up in the archives. I've looked it up, I think, 12 hours in a row one time. It's a lot of time, twice in one day.
John Hitchcock is.
I wrestled Greg in Texas, Greg Valentine, and Greg was great to work with. They call him a turtle because he was, he didn't move quick. He like his dad. But boy, when his dad showed up, good Lord Almighty!
Ooh,
my God, that Greg, I'd be covered up in the corner going, I don't. Your dad's here. I get it. I'm selling for you.
Piper will tell the same story, John, so you're not off. I know you're telling the truth because Piper tells the story. He hated it when John and Greg were on the same card. He said, I'm going to get the hell beat out of me.
Oh, my God. Gary, it was unbelievable. He would hit me so freaking hard. He would just beat the shit out of me. I'm like, oh, my God, Greg.
Greg said, too, he said, I hated getting booked with guys who had wrestled my dad because they, took it out on me.
Yeah, exactly.
He beat the hell out of them. And so, he would get the hell beat out of him because they had wrestled Johnny.
And Greg wasn't an easy guy to beat the hell out of.
No, he wasn't.
Right. Yeah. But he wanted it to be, he's a lot like Johnny. He wanted it to be real.
To be real. I always loved, and I don't know how many times I can't convince you that guy's real, but I can convince you this guy's real.
John Hitchcock is a friend of mine. He started going to matches in Greensboro in 1970 something. And he was telling me he would sit in the ringside seats. And he said one night, Johnny Valentine came down and he caught me with that stare. And he said, I swear to God, I almost pooped down both legs when he's looking at me like that. He goes, and he wouldn't look away. He just kept looking at me.
He'd stare at a guy. He'd pick somebody up and stare at him for 20 minutes.
That's pretty amazing. Amazing psychology.
That's how he got over. I mean, that's the word that you can describe Johnny Valentine.
I mean, he was one of those guys that he was not going to let the crowd control him. He was going to control them. I mean, it was a battle of wills, and he won. He
won every battle.
Yeah. Bull Curry had. I don't know, for people who don't know, but Bull Curry had bushy eyebrows. He had a stare. Bull Curry had a stare. Wild facial expressions, physical intensity. He didn't need costumes or gimmick. I mean, he was a living,
He was
walking,
a gimmick.
talking
He was a
gimmick.
gimmick.
Yeah, his whole face was the gimmick, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
his mannerisms communicated something bad was about to happen whenever he got in a wrestling ring. He could stand in front of a crowd and generate heat before he ever did anything. And there he is.
There's a wild bull.
I mean, that looks like a wrestler to me.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah.
I never got to wrestle him at all. I'd see him in St. Louis, and wow, I'd be fun to wrestle him, but I never got.
We just not earlier this year, we just lost his son, Flying Fred Curry, who followed him into the business in the 1960s and was a big star in South Texas as well.
He was a huge star up in the Detroit area too.
Yeah, Louis Tilley started booking Fred Curry in Corpus Christi in like the mid 60s.
When did Louis become a booker? I didn't know he was booker before Florida.
Yeah, he booked then. He booked in the 60s. I don't know when he first became a booker, but I know he was booking in the mid 60s because he was he did a program there where he was in the main event, and it was to get a match with Gene Kiniski, who was the NWA champion, and he put Fred over. That was Fred's first big push, and they did like a 6-week program.
Now, who's going to work with Kiniski?
Fred Curry. Yeah, they have Fred. So the winner of the match was going to get the title shot with Kiniski, and Tilley put Fred Curry over. He's only like 21 years old or something. Pretty amazing. But
Louis was a phenomenal booker too.
He really was. Well, that whole Dusty finish was actually a Louis Tilley finish.
Was Louis Tilley finish? Yeah.
Yeah.
Which was probably a Scarpolis finish.
Yes. It was a modification of a Sarpolis finish. So Curry and Valentine, Texas gave them their own championship that became virtually synonymous with them. In 1953, the NWA Texas Brass Knuckles Championship was introduced. And it was Curry and Manny McShane in the tournament final on March the 6th, 1953. And Bull Curry won the first Texas Brass Knuckles Championship tournament. And the creation and prominence of that title illustrated the unique place Bull Curry occupied in Texas wrestling. He was not just another wrestler passing through. He was a wrestling attraction that was Texas' own wrestling attraction, violent, unpredictable, and dangerous, that the championship itself could be presented differently from the traditional Texas heavyweight championship. Curry would be the defining figure associated with the Brass Knuckles title over the following years. He repeatedly won and lost it, creating a championship whose very identity became connected with blood, brawling, and physical punishment. His opponents included many of the most important Texas wrestlers of that era, including Fritz von Erich, Tony Bourne, Tough Tony Bourne, Waldo von Erich, Louis Tilley, and Killer Carl Cox. This was one of the greatest lessons of Bull Curry's career. Championships in the territory era were not always a measure of who was considered the best wrestler. Sometimes they were booking instruments, and a championship could be created or emphasized because a particular wrestler made that championship meaningful to the audience. And Bull Curry made the Texas Brass Knuckles title mean Bull Curry. He briefly held the Texas heavyweight title as well, but his real identity in Texas was not separated from the Brass Knuckles title. The distinction is significant because Curry did not need to be positioned as the technically superior wrestler in the territory. He just needed to be the guy that the audience wanted to see get beat, and that made him enormously valuable to Texas wrestling. His matches were chaotic. They blurred the lines between the wrestling show and an actual public disturbance. His reputation for provoking audiences was not simply wrestling storytelling devices. They were documented incidents of fans attacking him and serious disturbances surrounding his matches. In Galveston in 1958, a fan reportedly attacked Curry with an iron pipe during a match with Pepper Gomez. Curry chased the guy and retaliated and beat him to death almost with the iron pipe. Such stories became part of the mythology surrounding Bull Curry, reinforcing the perception that Bull Curry was a man who could turn an ordinary wrestling match into a riot. And that's where his nickname, the Walking Riot, becomes appropriate. Curry represented a transitional figure in wrestling history. He belongs to the generation where the later explosion of publicly hardcore wrestling gets exposed. Yet much of what would later become associated with hardcore wrestling was already present in his matches. The difference was Curry did not present himself as a specialist in a particular match. He was just Bull Curry. His violence was clearly driven by his own character and his own characteristics. The distinction separates Bull Curry from many later performances who deliberately adopted the imagery of hardcore wrestling. Curry's brutality was part of his persona long before hardcore became a marketing category. He was a heel whose fundamental selling point was normal wrestling rules could not contain him. Texas was particularly receptive to this kind of style. The state's wrestling audiences had already been conditioned by decades of rough and tumble wrestling, carnival traditions, and regional identities and personal rivalries. Curry could be dropped into Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Fort Worth, Corpus Christi, Galveston, or any other Texas market and immediately communicate what he was supposed to represent. He was the outsider who did not respect the rules. He was the man who who couldn't be hit too hard. He was the villain who could make the hometown babyface look heroic just by surviving. And of course, this might be the most important aspect of Curry's value to promoters. A great heel does not necessarily win matches. A great heel creates baby faces. And Bull Curry could make a popular Texas wrestler look courageous just by being in a match with him. A wrestler did not have to out-wrestle Curry to become a hero. He just had to stand up to him. And this made
Tony, you just think Bull Curry, I mean, the style, the people that he probably influenced without us even know, probably the original Sheik became when he developed that hardcore stuff. Gull Murphy, and as I mentioned, Brute Bernard before, and Big Joe LeDuc, and some of those guys that were just brutal. That was all Wild Bull Curry's character. I think.
That's just who he was. That's just who he was.
So his influence, was far and wide at that time.
Yeah, him and McShane, you could just put the formula: McShane plus Curry equals Texas wrestling. That's what it became.
Equal dollar signals, as we used to say. Curry.
Yeah, that's right. That feud went on and on and on and on. And the Curry family would eventually extend, we mentioned earlier, the legacy into another generation. His son, Fred Curry, became Flying Fred Curry, almost the complete opposite of his dad in presentation. He was Mr. High Spot. Where Bull was a frightening brawler, Fred was a clean-cut, spectacular babyface known for his drop kicks and his athletic style. Had one of the best drop kicks ever in the business. The father and son... Nevertheless,
Jim Barnett wanted to name him Dr. Dropkicks, and he left the territory. But he had Jim asked, "What do you want to use for a finish?" He said, 13 dropkicks. My boy, 13 dropkicks. Most of these guys can't even count to 13. He said, "I can, Jim." And no, let's cut it down to 2.
Oh, Fred will be in my cavalcade of stars.
Yeah.
So he used 2 drop kicks for a finish?
Yeah, 2 drop kicks for a finish.
When they're tag teamed together, it was crazy because you had the crazy brawling style of Bull and you had the amazing high spots of Fred, and it actually then later in his career endeared people to Bull Curry. He became a hero to people. And Fred had a lot to do with that because he was his son. And
Fred was a hell of a worker. He was a hell of a baby face. He really was. I don't think he gets the props that he should sometimes. But Fred, he said he was a trendsetter, and especially the contrast from his dad. You just kind of like a Dory and Terry Funk contrast, where Dory was a
totally
technician
different.
And Terry was a wild man. It was the same way with Pop and Son with Brian Fred and Wild Bill. Yeah.
You bet. Texas, and then they eventually moved back to the Midwest, and they'd work for the Sheik, and they'd work for Bruiser in Indianapolis, and that would be probably where they'd wrap up their career. The Texas Brass Knuckles Championship became one of Texas's great symbols of physical wrestling, and Bull Curry was its personality. His matches helped establish the idea that a Texas wrestling card could contain a match that was not just about determining who was the better wrestler. It could be about fight and survival. We lost
Now
Bull Curry.
we talking Houston and Dallas. Was he big as both?
He wrestled all across Texas, but he was a Houston mainstay. I mean, the McShane and Curry feud was primarily associated with Houston. Yeah. Bull Curry, we lost him on March the 8th, 1985 at 71. And by then, professional wrestling had changed so dramatically. Television had transformed the business yet again. Territories were disappearing, and the wrestling world had produced Curry that was giving way to a whole different industry. But the image of Bull Curry would never go away. The wild eyes, bushy eyebrows, the clenched fist, the punches, the rage, and the crowd screaming for somebody to stop him. In the history of Texas wrestling, Bull Curry occupies a very unique position. He was not a great technician, and he wasn't necessarily a wrestler who carried the most prestigious championship, but he made people mad, and he made people afraid, and that made money.
And he made them buy tickets.
Yep. So any other thoughts on Bull Curry at all? I mean, just a phenomenal wrestling personality,
Yeah, one of the unique characters in our business. I mean, without a mask, without, just a natural look about him and a natural style. I mean, I can just see him, the whole hunched over. I mean, it never seemed like he showed up straight. He was always in a crowd position.
Yeah,
I think he was such a tremendous influence on the '70s, on the '60s and '70s heels.
And we have a lot of younger fans that watch our shows that like it because they like to learn. And so go to YouTube, look up the Bull Curry Johnny Valentine match. It was either 69 or 70. It's out there on YouTube, and it's for the Texas title, and it's just phenomenal. Two rough and tumble guys that just beat the hell out of each other, but it's very
sort of the definition of Texas wrestling.
Yeah, but it's very engaging. I mean, you'll watch the whole thing. I promise you will.
Jerry, was there ever any association with, or same territories with Killer Tim Brooks and Bull Curry? Because they seem like two peas in a pod.
Well,
that's a good one.
You're exactly right. That's a great analogy there with Tim Brooks there. There had to be. I mean, because Tim, with a Texas type character,
he would be the same kind of Bull Curry category wrestler.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a great comp. I'd never thought of that.
Yeah,
that's a good one.
Yeah. And when I was searching for names earlier, Killer Brooks is definitely.
They would have crossed paths in the '70s. I don't know if they ever wrestled or not, but they would have. They in Houston particularly, and they would have probably been on the same cards at times as Bull was kind of coming to the end of his career, and Tim was hitting his heyday. They probably were on some cards together.
Even towards the end of his career, when I was seeing him in St. Louis, he was still a guy that you could go out there and go. I mean, he could go.
Yeah, it was constant action.
Yeah, he never seemed to slow down. I mean, with the age or anything, he just always seemed that methodical Killer Hill type guy. So, John, I think that's a great person.
That's a good one. Good comp. Good comparison. So we talked about him earlier. You can't talk about Houston wrestling in the 1960s and eventually in the early 70s without talking about Johnny Valentine. I mean, if you want to talk about the most important Houston headliners of the early to mid 60s, Johnny Valentine would have to be close to the top of the list. John Theodore Wisniewski was born in 1928, Maple Valley, Washington. He got in professional wrestling in 1947. He would spend nearly 30 years building a reputation that was based less on flamboyance than on credibility physically. His career carried him through almost every important wrestling territory, as well as Canada, Japan, and other international markets. By the time his career ended in 1975 in October in that plane crash that also had David Crockett and Ric Flair and Tim Woods involved, and Bob Bruggers. Johnny Valentine became one of the most important wrestlers produced by the territory system. What made Valentine unusual is that his reputation did not depend on a single territory, a single championship, or a single promoter. He was valuable because he could walk into a territory and immediately become a major attraction. His identity was toughness. He believed that professional wrestling had to look convincing, and he developed a style built around hard physical contact, deliberate pacing, and an almost intimidating economy of movement. He did not need to sprint around the ring or perform acrobatics. Just his presence was enough. He was a big man for his generation. He was about 6'4", weighed 250 pounds, but had a powerful frame and an imposing appearance. His physical presentation helped establish the character. He looked like someone who could legitimately hurt you. That quality became central. That quality became central to his career because his style was built around control. He could slow a match down, he could isolate an opponent, he could attack a body part, and gradually make the audience believe that his opponent was being systematically dismantled. His matches were built around punishment than athleticism. In one respect, he was the clearest representatives of the traditional wrestling philosophy that a match should tell a physical story. He became particularly effective as a heel because audiences believed that he actually was hurting the babyface. And that distinction is important because many heels are disliked because they cheated. Valentine was disliked because the audiences believed he was dangerous. Valentine's career accelerated during the 50s. He became a regular in major territories. His early career included work against some of the biggest names of the era, including Buddy Rogers. And by the time the 50s were over, he had become an established championship level performer. His relationship with the Capital Wrestling Territory, that would eventually become the WWF, which would become the WWF, which would become today's WWE, was especially significant. In the late 50s and early 60s. The territory was one of the most important wrestling markets in the United States. Valentine became a fixture there and captured the NWA United States Television Championship, becoming the first champion in 1958, and he held it 5 times. The championship was retired in 1962, with Valentine being the final champion. That achievement illustrates something important about his career. He was not simply a touring wrestler passing through New York. Promoters considered him sufficiently valuable to build championships and major television programs around. He also became involved in the United States Tag Team Championship, working with Jerry Graham, Buddy Rogers, and Bob Ellis. His partnership with Buddy Rogers was particularly noteworthy because both of them represented different versions of the same large wrestling philosophy, professional wrestling based on toughness, credibility, and personality rather than athletic exhibition. Valentine was becoming increasingly national in scope. Toronto became the next important stop in his development. Wrestling in Canada was part of the territory system.
Tony, you say Valentine becoming increasingly national. This is done through the territory. This wasn't done through the Dumont network or the other major network.
Right. It was just him moving from territory to territory.
From territory to territory. That's how over he was becoming nationwide, where he becomes such an influence nationwide.
Toronto was his next stop. Wrestling in Canada was a major part of the territory system. Valentine became a significant championship performer there. In the 1960s, he won the NWA International Tag Team Championship with several partners. His work in Toronto brought him into major programs with Bruno Sammartino, Gene Kiniski, Whipper Watson, and Bulldog Brower. The significance of these matches goes beyond individual title history. Valentine was becoming part of the international network of top-level wrestlers who moved between territories and carried their reputations with them. That mobility was one of the great strengths of the territory system. A wrestler didn't have to remain permanently in one city to become a star. Instead, like Valentine, they could have a reputation in New York, Toronto, Texas, Florida, Detroit, Japan, or Missouri, and carry that reputation to the next place. Johnny Valentine was one of the exceptional wrestlers who was very, very good at this. And Texas was one of the most important chapters of his career. He became closely associated with wrestling territories operated by Southwest Sports and the broader Texas network. In Texas, Valentine was particularly well suited to the environment because his wrestling persona fit the style of hard physical wrestling. He became a major figure in both Dallas and Houston and worked against many of the most important Texas stars of the period. His championship resume in Texas was extraordinary. He won the Texas Heavyweight Championship 9 times and the Texas version of the Brass Knuckles Championship 5 times. Those titles are particularly appropriate for Johnny Valentine. The Texas Brass Knuckles Championship that had been created for McShane and Curry was not another championship. Its very name represented the physical style that promoters wanted audiences to associate with Texas wrestling. And Valentine fit that perfectly. He could be presented as a champion who did not need an elaborate gimmick. His body language, his facial expression, and his wrestling style communicated his character. This became one of the defining features of Johnny Valentine's Texas career. He was also involved with the NWA American Heavyweight Championship, which evolved from the Texas Championship structure and became almost as important for the Dallas territory during the late 60s and 70s. Texas also provided Valentine with an important connection to the emerging generation of wrestlers who would eventually define the next stage of the territory era. His programs with Fritz von Erich and other Texas stars helped establish the kind of physical, intense wrestling that became the trademark of Texas wrestling. He wasn't a high flyer. He wasn't a technical exhibitionist. He wasn't dependent on spectacular finishing moves. He was just credible. He worked deliberate. He attacked individual parts of the body. He used punches, kicks, holds, and pressure. He could make a relatively simple sequence feel important because the audience understood the physical consequences. His wrestling was extremely compatible with television. Television wrestling did not always require spectacular matches. It just required a recognizable personality and a simple story that audiences could understand and follow. And
I got to jump in there because to me, that's what a contrast that we're discussing here. Because Johnny, you look at television matches, movement. When Johnny's matches were not movement, they were psychology. So he had to be getting out over just from his facial and his body movement, his facial expression, and the way he moved his body around, and the way he applied holds and everything to make that television match seem like it's a great match, Other than like you say, other guys flip flopping and flying around. Even during that time, movement was a lot in television.
Right. Well, and so what creates heat though is that the heel cuts a babyface off, right? Right. And then Johnny Valentine was constantly that. He was constantly keeping the babyface under pressure.
He's letting the babyface do the work and the movement.
Yeah, right. And so that was perfect television. And we got to keep in mind too that people had not seen wrestling on television that much. So he was establishing it. It wasn't like he had to reverse it. So today, if you were going to go to something like that, you'd have to slowly but surely dial that back.
That's the reason they say it took him longer to get over because of that song.
Right. Any other thoughts about Johnny?
No, he was a hell of a performer, man. Hell of a man.
Jerry, where did you work with him most? Florida?
Where did you
work with him most?
Carolinas.
Oh, the Carolinas.
Yeah, I went to Japan for 6 weeks. I left as Mid-Atlantic champion, came back, and Johnny Valentine was champion. I didn't complain at all.
Johnny Valentine was the guy that George Scott brought in to start converting it from a tag team territory.
Exactly. Him and Wahoo.
So it became more singles based. They brought in Johnny and Wahoo.
Were you ever around any of Johnny's ribs, Jerry?
Yeah, when he defecated a few times in people's bags. Yeah, that
was his most notorious rib, wasn't it?
And he'd break off the shower. He said he'd break off the shower head, right?
Yeah, break off the shower head. Yeah, if somebody was bitching or something like that, he'd just go and break off the shower. Where Hodge would go in and turn the hot water so off you couldn't get it on.
Medusa told the story one time. Well, she told it with us on our show when she went the first date with Greg. She's sitting there in a restaurant, in a public restaurant, and she feels something splashing on her feet, and Greg starts laughing. It's Johnny pissing at the table.
He did that to us over in Tarpon Springs over at a Greek restaurant.
Really?
They loved it though. Yeah, Johnny was a character. You know, after the plane crash, I Booker with him here in Florida for over a year, about a year and a half, and finally ran his course. And he couldn't make any of the towns because he was in a wheelchair and everything. And back in those days, the wheelchair accessible was not a law like it is now. But we're in St. Petersburg. And there was a picture with a lot of wrestlers. There's a set of steps right there that you can look out and see the ring in its entirety. So all the wrestlers would get there. So Johnny was booking, and so Johnny had a cop go over and set a chair there, right there where he could see everything. So he's sitting there. He's in braces. Both legs are in braces. He's on those. Got to push himself up and down with crutch and get up and down. So he's watching the matches. Pretty soon this cop gets interested in the matches, so he starts moving his way over to where Johnny is. So Johnny reaches out with his crutch, and taps the cop on the shoulder. Move. And of course the cop moves and everything. But as we keep going, the cop gets interested in the matches again. Finally, he moved over again. Johnny tapped him again. The cop moved. Third time, the cop's over there really getting into the match. Johnny, you can see, something's going to happen. Johnny takes his legs, hooks them, braces them out, gets his cane, pushes himself up. Johnny shoots him back. He walks up to that cop back, spit a whole wad of tobacco right that damn cop back at that cop. First he, ready for a fight. Then he turns around and sees it's Valentine. Then he starts apologizing. That's the funniest thing I've ever seen. But he didn't care, man. That was Johnny.
Wow.
True.
Hey, was it him or Red Bastine? Remember the story where one of them fell, another one pissed on him? You heard that story?
No.
Yeah, either him or Red Bastine. I can't remember which one it was. One of them fell, and he goes, "Oh, help me up! I can't get up." And he goes, "You can't get up?" And it was on the other one. The other one pissed on him, and they both laughing about it. They think it's funny. I mean, those guys were nuts.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you like to have taken a lot of plane rides with Johnny? I mean, can you imagine?
No.
Can you imagine what he would have done to people on a plane?
Yeah.
Well, wasn't Johnny Valentine the booker when you tried to get Hogan started, and he didn't think it was going to work?
Well, he didn't like Hogan at all. He didn't like him at all because he couldn't. He was just, like all of us. He couldn't work in the beginning. There's just a big muscle guy. Johnny just wouldn't book him. I would have to book Hogan myself on cards, and I knew Johnny wasn't paying attention to because we ran a lot of spot shows then. So I booked Hogan on the spot show just to get him some work.
I know he went down.
He and I were booking when I brought Hogan in here.
I know that he went down to San Antonio and booked down there some for Blanchard. What did you think of Johnny as a booker?
Horrible.
Really?
Horrible booker. He had, John, his only thing was he nearly killed Pedro to death with Lars Anderson, making him go hour Broadways, and those two there. Neither one of those. Pedro couldn't wrestle with Lars, and Lars couldn't do the spots with Pedro. And you can only imagine our matches with that. That's all he goes. Send them to Broadway. Send them to Broadway. Send them to Broadway. I get down there, the guys. I call Eddie. Eddie, we can't. We just did an hour last week. Well, what's Johnny? He wants another hour. Oh, he would raise hell. Oh, do what you feel is right. Give us the talent. Do what's right. So I'd have to change everything. Then Johnny would get pissed off at me, But
yeah,
our towns were dropping like crazy. That's the reason Johnny didn't last long as a booker here.
What was Eddie's thought about even trying to use him like that?
Well, him and Eddie were fouls, so Eddie felt sorry for him. So he like a lot of those other booking jobs he were getting, it was just kind of out of helping an old friend out. But
yeah,
when your business starts going south like it was here, boom, and so we would let Johnny go, and I became one. Then Eddie brought Dusty in after shortly. Dusty kind of followed me and Johnny.
Yeah, his last years were were horrible. His whole body broke down, and
Yeah, yeah.
Was
I mean, everybody loved Johnny. I mean, everybody, of course, respect was not even I don't even mention because everybody respected, but everybody loved Johnny. He was a good guy. I mean,
yeah,
Johnny was
sure.
a good guy to be around. Had Greg's personality.
But he probably
Yeah,
was like
yeah.
he was probably like a lot of high performers. He probably expected other people to be able to do stuff he could do, and
He expected people to have the psychology that he had.
right, and it just he
Yeah,
was disappointed when they couldn't, and
when
sort of
they had no psychology.
Like a Michael Jordan or a Magic Johnson trying to
Yeah.
coach other players. They couldn't do the things they could.
Elevate them to your level where
Right.
they don't have that ability to do it. But
What
I
a
mean,
cool what a cool presence he had, though. I mean, he had a
Oh my
presence about
gosh.
him. You know,
oh
even when he was
God,
on
yeah.
his walkers and later in life, he'd come in and you're like, oh shit, that's Johnny Valentine. He just
I mean, he made Skip Young into Sweet Brown Sugar, and Skip wasn't drawing a dime for us, and he put that mask on Skip, and we're going to call him Sweet Brown Sugar, which was a controversial name at the time,
He
Black guy being Sweet Brown, but Johnny gave him that name, and Skip started drawing like a son of a gun. Tyree Pride, another black kid, he made him into a star down there. So,
that's why Cocoa Ware was Sweet Brown Sugar in Tennessee is
yeah,
because Lawler saw it in Florida and came
exactly.
back
Lawler
and
was here at the time. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
came back and put Cocoa Ware in that
Yeah, but
same.
that was Johnny Valentine's
When he went
creation.
to San Antonio, he brought Buddy Roberts in and made him Dale Valentine,
Yeah, yeah,
and
I
he
remember that.
managed him in the wheelchair. I thought he did a good job as a manager.
Yeah.
He got heat.
That probably would have been the best role for Johnny instead of Booker because Johnny, like I said, Johnny didn't know anything but our Broadway.
Right,
He
right.
was killing our talent. I mean, it was
He could do his match, but nobody else could do his match.
yeah,
And
exactly. And
yeah,
that's what he expected. Everybody to do that style of match. And nobody had the psychology that Johnny had, or the ring presence. I'll say that too, that Johnny had.
some of these other
He,
guys some of these other guys will go more in depth in later on, but I'll just mention a few other important Houston guys during this time period. Professor Boris Malenko, of course, his sons are good friends of yours and ours, Jerry. Malenko was an important heel attraction. He was Larry Simon, but he was portraying a Russian communist and a foreign menace character, and it was really, really effective in the 1960s. He had a huge program with Eddie Graham in
Jody
Florida.
tells a great story about there. At Miami during that time, there were a lot of snowbirds come down. A lot of people, a lot of Jewish people from Jersey come down. So, the great Malenko, this Jewish lady, booing out, and finally this Jewish lady gets fed up. Malenko, I don't know why you're calling yourself for them. You're just an old Jewish boy from New Jersey, screaming out, everybody around. Malenko trying to get her. Shut up, shut up.
You're blowing my gimmick.
Yeah.
But in Houston, it was pretty effective because you could have Bull Curry in a big brawl, and then you'd have Dory Funk Sr. and Malenko come out and do a heck of a wrestling match. So he as a heel, he provided a lot of great contrast because he could work. Stan Stasiak was another big heel of this time period. He was prominent during the second half of the 60s. He had a physical appearance and aggressive style that made him effective in Texas. Jose Lothario, who we will talk more about when we talk about.
One of my heroes. I loved Jose.
Yeah, we'll talk more about him when we talk about San Antonio and Corpus Christi. Gory Guerrero was big in Houston as well, one of the most important wrestlers in Mexican wrestling history and a foundational figure in the Gory Guerrero wrestling dynasty family. What mattered most to Houston's wrestling identity during the 60s? The primary major attractions were Johnny Valentine, Bull Curry, Danny McShane, and Fritz von Erich. I'd say those are the four most particular that are important. National level attractions, Lou Thez, Vern Gagne, Ray Gunkel. But the major Texas heels, I would say Carl Cox, Professor Boris Malenko, Stan Stasiak, and Bull Curry. And then you have the Texas American Mexican stars that were draws like Jose Lothario and Gory Guerrero. Those were the primary drivers as far as wrestlers in Houston. They drew a lot of money and a lot of crowds every Friday night to the City Auditorium and Sam Houston Coliseum.
Now, Paul's taken over at this time with all this talent that you're mentioning. What did Paul just have a tremendous relationship with promoters across the United States, or what was Paul's
Paul had a tremendous relationship with Houston. You know, he was just very connected. Where a lot of promoters were very connected with the larger geography, he was just really connected to the city of Houston, and the fans had been there since radio and then the beginning of television, and then throughout his whole promotion history to 1987. I mean, Paul was just really, really connected. Only had, I think, 2 cancellations ever in the history of wrestling in Houston. He always came through with the show, and always had the people on the show that he advertised.
There were 2 guys like that. There were 2 guys like that that had that reputation, and Paul had that shining reputation. The other was, of course, Sam Munchick in St. Louis. I think the 2 of them, their careers as promoters almost mirrored each other.
Yeah, you couldn't separate Sam Muchnick from the city of St. Louis. You know, he was he was a sports writer there in the 20s, and then involved in wrestling and boxing in the 30s and the 40s, then became a promoter himself right before World War II, and just had a tremendous relationship with the city of St. Louis. And, you know, I was looking the other day, you know, when Sam was a booking office and he was sending talent and was promoting in other towns besides St. Louis, it was funny. He was involved with Louisville. He was involved with Memphis. He was involved with the minor league towns of the St. Louis Cardinals. I just noticed that the other day, that his relationship with the Cardinals was deep as well.
Him and the original Bush were tight friends.
Yeah, to the point where he didn't really promote wrestling in summer, because that was baseball season, and he didn't want to compete with the Cardinals. So when the Cardinals baseball season was over, he picked up and started promoting again during the year.
And Bosch was a lot like Sam.
Yeah, very, very much so. All right. Do you want to move on to Dallas, or you want to be done for today, or what do you guys want?
Let's be done for today. I got another show I got to do when I'm taking Bruce's place on. But you know, one thing. I
thought you stole.
No, you stole Bruce's show.
That's right. I stole Bruce's show. That's right. You know, it's just amazing to me. Houston is such a population center. I don't know why Bosch wouldn't run a territory there. You know, you got so many big towns around. You know, Dallas, you know, was had a big territory there, but those towns weren't as big. You had Dallas, Fort Worth, but the other towns weren't very big. Houston, you had access all the way down to Shreveport and all the way across to Corpus and San Antonio. And I mean, it just seemed like you'd run a territory out of it. And Paul Bosch was content to run just the big shows.
I don't think he wanted to do that, because Morris Siegel had done that. He had run a territory out of Houston with the Texas Wrestling Agency. And I think Bosch just saw all of the headaches that came with booking talent to different towns and different promoters. I just think he wanted to focus on Houston. And we will talk about it next week on our show when we talk about Dallas and Fritz von Erich. When Houston becomes part of the Dallas territory, and the booking office changes from Houston to Dallas, because Bosch just didn't want to mess with it. And Fritz was ambitious and entrepreneurial and wanting to expand, and so Houston then became Dallas's Friday night town.
In all honesty, as a talent back in those days, when you think of Houston and Dallas, you only think of those 2 cities. You think of Houston as being independent, being Houston. And when you go into Houston, you didn't think you're going to work 3 or 4 other shots. You were going to work Houston. Well, and to my thinking, too, Dallas was the same way, because Dallas was the sportatorium, and you didn't hear a lot of the other towns. It seemed like Amarillo was really the only true territory at the time where you had multiple towns that you thought about. You know.
From 1966 to 1978, if you worked as a talent from the Dallas booking office, you worked Fort Worth on Monday night, you work Dallas on Tuesday night, you work San Antonio Wednesday night, you work Corpus Christi on Thursday night, you work Houston on Friday night, and you worked Austin once a month on Saturday, or you worked a spot show. That was the Dallas territory for about 12 years there from the mid-60s.
And the Houston territory was what?
Houston territory, when they ran one, had Beaumont, Galveston, I think a town or two in Louisiana. That was the territory that was
probably
run,
what, Bossier City or something.
Something like
or
that,
Lake Charles,
or maybe Shreveport.
Lake Charles,
but that was when Morris Siegel was running it as a territory, and I just think when Bosch took the reins,
his
he
brother
had
was
Bosch
promoting Shreveport.
Yeah, Morris Siegel's brother, Julius. I think when Bosch had been actually, Morris Siegel was running the business of the booking office in Houston. So Bosch basically ran the promotion of Houston, promoting the cards and making sure Friday night came off. So when Siegel passed away, I think Bosch thought, I just want to keep doing what I'm doing. I don't want to mess with all the headaches of all the talent management and the promoters complaining about not getting certain matches and all of that. I think he just didn't want to mess with it.
Yeah. John, I got a T-shirt for you. You know how we're talking about Valentine here, Valentine Wahoo, where Greg had I broke Wahoo's leg. You get a T-shirt. I stole Bruce's show.
Oh my God, that's great. Yes, I love it.
We should do that.
I love it. Yes, I'll be happy to.
I stole Bruce's show.
That's right.
Instead of I broke Wahoo's leg. That's awesome.
That's right.
I like it.
I'd be happy to.
That's fantastic.
There you go.
I like it.
Well, there you have it. Episode 11. We'll be back next week with God more from
Texas again. Texas
going back.
Again.
We're going to Dallas next week.
God bless
Texas.